All right. So we left off with the realities of radical Reconstruction. So what we talked about last class was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and we also talked about Congress taking control of the South. What type of occupation did they inflict on the South? Military, very good. We have military occupation. Do y'all remember how many districts they broke the South up into? Hunger Games style? 5 districts, very good. Remember, there are now strings attached for the South, and that is they have to rewrite their state constitutions, which we've already talked about. They also have to ratify both the 13th and the 14th Amendment, and they're also going to be expected to ratify the 15th Amendment, which will give African American men the right to vote. Remember, the amendments are kind of like stepping stones. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment provides equal protection under the law for all U.S.-born citizens. And the 15th Amendment provides African American men the right to vote. Were the ladies happy about this? They're not. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So, under radical Reconstruction, which was primarily congressional Reconstruction, African Americans are now having the opportunity to organize politically. And we're going to see this mainly done through what was called the Union League. The Union League was a political, African American political organization established as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. What the Union League's goal was to create a network of political clubs to educate their members in civic responsibility and to campaign for Republican candidates. They built churches, they built schools, they recruited militia force for protection of their communities. This also leads to our first group of African Americans actually running for and being elected to political office in American history. For example, there are African Americans that will hold political office at the local, state, and the federal level. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were 2 of the first African Americans to be elected to Congress from the state of Mississippi. African Americans held seats in both the House and in the Senate. Another really famous guy that was elected to Congress is Robert Smalls from South Carolina. He had served as a Union spy during the Civil War, and he had also successfully captured a Confederate ship, which was pretty remarkable. It's estimated that 2,000 African Americans held political office during the Reconstruction era, which is amazing. But sadly, in that post-Reconstruction era of Jim Crow, it's not going to take very long for African Americans to not only lose their seats in office, but also lose the ability to register to vote and to actually carry out the vote or run for office. I'm going to talk about that at the end of today's lesson. So, Southern whites absolutely despise military Reconstruction, military occupation as a result of radical Reconstruction. 2 groups that they really, really hated were scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners who ended up joining the Republican Party. So there's a really famous guy from the Civil War that a lot of people don't remember all that well. Has anyone ever heard of a guy by the name of General Longstreet before? General James Longstreet? They called him Old Pete. Well, a big reason why Longstreet is often forgotten is because he was the most famous scalawag of the post-war era. He joined the Republican Party. That's why you could only find, if you're ever cared to look, think about all those statues that were put up of Lee and Jackson and Davis. Well, Longstreet had 2. One in the cemetery where he's buried in Georgia, and another commemorating his service at Gettysburg. So that was a resented group in the South. The carpetbaggers are a little bit more interesting. Well, I don't know if you would say interesting. They're a little more complex. Carpetbaggers were basically anyone from the North who came to the South to help rebuild the South. Now, there are numerous carpetbaggers who came south for the right reasons. Like, for example, a teacher that would have worked in what organization would have been a good example of a carpetbagger doing good? What organization helped educate African Americans? Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? But there were a lot of carpetbaggers that were coming south to buy up land cheap and to get involved in politics, and they became quite corrupt. So that becomes a bit of an issue. Sadly, a sort of culmination of African Americans gaining rights, former Confederates joining the Republican Party, and people from the North coming to the South to either help or take advantage of the situation, tragically leads to the rise of what is known as the Invisible Empire, the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan is going to spread throughout the South with the main goal of intimidating African Americans from voting, running for political office, or gaining jobs. Grant, when he comes into office, one of his main domestic goals during Reconstruction is to crush the Ku Klux Klan with military force. It's going to lead to a congressional act known as the Enforcement Act of 1871. This actually successfully happens, but sadly, in the early 1900s, the Klan will be reborn, which we'll talk about as we get into the era of like when we get into that Gilded Age progressive era. So, these are some pretty famous cartoons from the era. Two of these cartoons are done by Thomas Nast. What Nast has done here on the left, he has this carpetbagger who is got a sack full of what? Money, right? He's got a sack full of cash because there's no cash flow in the South. And he's going down south to buy up land cheap and take advantage of the South. And what Nast is trying to do is to try to portray what the stereotypical carpetbagger would have looked like to the American public. In the center there, this is in reference to the scalawags. It says Southern types, the wolf and the lamb in politics. So we have a Southerner who leaves the Democratic Party, goes to the Republican Party, and is trying to appeal to the African American voter. And then on the right here, this is another famous Nast cartoon of the White League, which were like militia forces in the South in league with the Ku Klux Klan. So that's, again, more about what complicates Reconstruction in the South. Remember, we talked a little bit about this earlier in the lesson, the Readjuster Party here in Virginia. The Readjuster Party, political coalition of a variety of political groups. Virginia was really quite interesting in the Reconstruction era because you have a lot of different political flavors happening in the post-war era. And what this Readjuster group were a group of moderate Republicans, and I guess you could kind of say in the modern sense, liberal Democrats, so to speak, not as liberal as we would consider in the 21st century, but for this post-war era, quite liberal and quite progressive. The reason that they get the name Readjuster is because, remember, the Confederate debt after the war had been erased. But there are some strings attached here, guys. When southern states re-enter the Union, they regain the debts that they had from the start of the war. So when Virginia comes back into the Union in 1870, they've got their pre-war debt. Why would they be upset about that debt? Or they feel like it needs to be readjusted? They didn't sell it, they lost it. West Virginia seceded, right? So they want the debt readjusted because they don't want to accrue all of this debt that might be should be in the lap of West Virginia in their minds. Does that make sense? Okay. So the readjusters, their aspiration was to break the power of wealth and establish privilege in Virginia. Like they wanted to bring that to an end, which is again pretty progressive in this era. They don't want to return to the status quo of the pre-war era or the antebellum era. So the platform was to settle state debts, readjust the state pre-war debt with West Virginia. They want to end the poll tax, meaning that you did not have to pay to vote in the state of Virginia. They want to provide civil service reform for poor whites and African Americans, because what does Virginia need to do after the war? I.e. Richmond.
Industrialize.
Yes, they need to industrialize and they need to rebuild. Okay? So much of Virginia and the South have been destroyed, and they want to use civil service jobs to be able to rebuild. They also promoted public education for poor white and African American children. Now, this is revolutionary, but I do want you to realize this is not a perfect scenario. This is segregated education that they're proposing. So I do want to make that clear. All right? I'm not trying to put the readjusters on this grandiose pedestal. I do want you to realize there were people in the South in the post-war era that are actually trying to do the right thing to bring their states back into the Union. The two guys that led the readjuster movement, Billy Mahone, who had served as a general under Robert E. Lee, and Harrison Riddleberger of Woodstock, who had been a Confederate officer and ran a newspaper in Woodstock, Virginia. Billy Mahone was actually a railroad mini tycoon, I guess you could say, in the post-war era. That would probably be the best way to put it. Mahone, controlling force in Virginia politics from around 1870, the re-entry of Virginia into the Union, until about 1883. But all this kind of comes to an end when Reconstruction ends. The conservative Democrats, many of which were Civil War vets, are going to take back control of their governments. And one really, really powerful conservative Democrat that takes control of Virginia is Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew. And we'll actually talk a little bit about him as we move forward. What we refer to this when the former Confederates that want to return to the status quo take control of their governments again, we call that home rule. So now we move into the Grant administration. Obviously, Andrew Johnson is not going to get picked up on the Republican ticket because he's not a Republican. He's a Democrat. And the Democrats don't want to mess with him either. So Grant is going to be the logical choice for the Republicans because he's a war hero, right? He's electable. He's like one of these people in American history where he didn't seek out the office sought him out. Has that happened before? Yeah. Will it happen again?
Probably.
No doubt. Like, think about Eisenhower, right, after World War II. It wasn't like Eisenhower had to do a whole lot to get the Republicans to circle the wagon around him, okay? That's a story for a different day. So Grant is going to be a two-termer. In his first term, he'll defeat Horatio Seymour, Democratic candidate. In his second election, he'll defeat Horace Greeley. Honestly, he serves during most of Reconstruction. We just kind of get caught up in the whole Andrew Johnson battle between he and Congress and the impeachment. Grant, two-termer, he's kind of like on the cusp of somewhere. I guess you could put him in the moderate camp, but he works with the radicals. Fiscally, he's moderate. Socially, he's a little more radical. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. The different, like, for example, Grant believed that African Americans should have rights, and he supported those rights. But he also believed that the Confederates needed to be able to move on with their lives, the former Confederates, and he's going to push for amnesty for all the former Confederates in 1872. See the complication there? All right. So he advocated for the rights of freedmen and education and voting rights. He also opposed retribution toward the former Confederate officers and soldiers. But Grant's time in office is mainly tarnished due to corruption. And this isn't corruption that Grant carried out. This is corruption that other people carried out tied to Grant's administration. There are really three famous events that occurred as a result of this. But before I explain those, I want you to understand that politics in the post-Civil War era, at the local, state, and federal level, north, south, and west, there's widespread corruption going on. All right? So, three political scandals. Black Friday. This is where two very notorious railroad tycoons by the name of Jay Gould and Jim Fisk attempted to corner the American gold market to their advantage, which is sort of what we would consider insider trading today. And it caused a sharp panic on Wall Street. The Whiskey Ring was a tax evasion scandal led by members of the government to basically steal tax revenue from taxation on alcohol in the post-war era. Credit Mobilier, probably the most famous of the three, was a construction company that had a government contract to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, but those stockholders, many of which were members of Congress and also one of which was the Vice President of the United States, were defrauding the government by inflating the price of the cost of the job and pocketing federal money due to overspeculation. So, sadly for Grant, he really doesn't know what's going on with these scandals until after the fact. And no one could really pin him on Grant, but as you see in this cartoon, it shows Grant as an acrobat hanging on to all of these corrupt officials tied to his administration. Grant also had to deal with one of the worst financial panics in American history, the Panic of 1873. I'm going to talk more about this panic in Lesson 11 in the Gilded Age. We have a massive bank failure occur, and we also have 18,000 businesses fail, many of which were railroad companies. Unemployment rose to 14%. Believe it or not, though, Grant actually stepped in and made some fiscally conservative decisions to try to help correct the panic. This was one of the first times that, well, not the first time that a president stepped in to try to help correct the panic. Monroe tried to do the same in 1819, but this was a bit of a better response than what we saw Martin Van Buren do in 1837. there is some important and positive things that Grant does accomplish. He enforced civil rights laws. He destroyed the first Ku Klux Klan. He improved foreign policy and relations with Britain through the Treaty of Washington. Remember, our relationship with Britain was very, very rocky during the Civil War, so that helped smooth things over. Also, has anyone out there ever been to Yellowstone before? Nobody? Oh, it's a life-changing experience. Who wants to go to Yellowstone? You've been? Would you agree? Yeah. It's a moving experience. And if you like to fly fish, it's like Disney World. Just throwing that out there. So, a lot of times, what president do we typically give all the credit for the parks movement? Anybody know? Very good. Teddy Roosevelt. Excellent job. He just picks up the pace. It starts with Grant. So, that's a little bit about the Grant administration. Lee in the post-war era. Lee is never arrested. He's never tried for treason. He never gets involved in politics. Well, he has his opinions, but he doesn't run for political office. He takes a job in Lexington at Washington College. He is going to encourage former Confederates to reconcile and reunite. He is also very supportive of the South, especially Virginia, developing colleges and universities to educate Southerners. Where are my Hokies at? I know you're out there. You're rocking a Tech shirt today, right? Robert E. Lee has nothing to do with the founding of Virginia Tech, but was supportive of Virginia Tech's establishment, because what was Virginia Tech established as? What type of college? Military and technical. It's a military college with engineering. Does anybody know the founder of Virginia Tech? Ooh, James Lane. Lane Stadium in Blacksburg. James Lane, former Confederate military officer, graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, graduate of UVA, believe it or not, becomes the founder of Virginia Tech. All right? So, I want to be clear, Lee doesn't go after any political career in the post-war era. After his death, they'll rename the college Washington and Lee University. Frederick Douglass, arguably our most important and influential abolitionist of the pre-war era, advisor to Lincoln during the Civil War, and very important in pushing Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and also to recruit African Americans to serve in the war. In the post-war era, Douglass becomes a major supporter of the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. He encourages the government to protect the rights of freedmen. He encourages the government to provide African Americans with the right and the ability to get jobs in civil service. And he also goes on to serve as one of the first African American ambassadors for the U.S. to Haiti. Questions about Frederick Douglass in the post-war era? All right. Bum, bum, bum. The end of Reconstruction. The election of 1876. Politicos and political scientists have often referred to this as the last battle of the Civil War. The two candidates on the left here, Rutherford B. Hayes, Union General from Ohio, and on the right, Samuel Tilden, urban Democrat from New York, who was famous for busting up the Boss Tweed ring in New York City, which I'll talk more about in Lesson 11. This crew is one of the closest elections in American history. it was nearly 50-50 in both the House, my apologies, in both the electoral and in the popular vote. I just gave away my question that I was going to ask you. What House in Congress determines a tie in the presidency? Which side? The Senate or the House? The House. Remember, this has happened before, right? The House of Representatives had to decide the outcome of the election of 1800, and they also had to determine the outcome of the election of 1824. Okay? However, crew, check it out. Why would they not be interested in the House making this choice?
Because it's Republican dominated.
Very good. It is dominated by Republicans. There are very few Democrats in Congress. So they are going to create a special commission. That commission will be made up of 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and a Supreme Court justice. They're going to make the backroom deal. Rutherford B. Hayes and the Republicans will get the White House. The South will regain control of their home rule. And there will be a promise that a southern transcontinental rail line will be built that will connect New Orleans to California. All right? It is called the Compromise of 1877. There are a lot of people very upset about this. So much so they called Rutherford B. Hayes Rutherford B. Hayes. All right? We're going to move into a bit of a lame duck period in the presidency in this post-Reconstruction era. Because this is going to be the time where those powerful robber barons come to power. And my question always to students is, can anyone out there name a powerful tycoon from the late 1800s or the early 1900s? Anybody? Okay, who was that? Does anybody know the Standard Oil guy? Rockefeller, very good. Vanderbilt, very good. Anybody else? Anybody else out there? My next question, can anybody name a president between Rutherford B. Hayes and Teddy Roosevelt? That's how powerful those guys were. You all can remember at least 2 of them. You don't know or can't remember a president from who's heard about Rutherford B. Hayes for the first time in their life today. Thank you for your honesty. That's normal. Okay? That's how powerful those guys were. So, that's the direction that we're heading in. What's up? Question?
Did Teddy Roosevelt become president because he was assassinated?
Yeah, very good. William McKinley. Excellent job. All right. So, when the South retakes control of their southern governments, they become known as the Redeemers. They're trying to go back to the status quo. And sadly, this is going to lead to the spread of Jim Crow, and it will be upheld through Plessy v. Ferguson. I'm going to teach you about Plessy in lesson 11 in detail. All right? Okay. Women continue to fight for suffrage. The ladies aren't happy. They pick back up their torch in the post-war era. And they want more than just voting rights. They want labor rights, because a lot of women worked during the war. They want the opportunity to own land. And there are women out there that want the opportunity to run for political office. All right? This is going to be the last hurrah for our old suffragettes that we've talked about from the pre-war era. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. This is the end for them. They're going to have to pass the torch on, and we're going to talk about the next group of women that will carry the torch in the progressive era in lesson 12. So, Susan B. Anthony was actually arrested for voting for Grant in his reelection, fined $100, and put on trial for voting. Women started to protest and campaign against the 14th and 15th Amendment because it specifically guaranteed citizenship and equal rights in the 14th Amendment initially to males. And in the 15th Amendment, it only provided African American men the right to vote. This will lead to the foundation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890 to lobby for the right to vote. But again, they passed the torch to a new generation. Women will not receive the right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This will be 13 years after the death of Susan B. Anthony. So we're going to revisit our suffragettes here in the not too distant future. So the legacy of Reconstruction is one that is complicated, as I've said before. Southerners regarded Reconstruction as worse than the war itself, as they resented the upending of their social and racial system. The Republicans had good intentions, but the improvement of the South and the post-war era of the New South will remain a very tragic and poor scenario in society for African Americans. This will ultimately lead to the birth of the modern civil rights movement. The New South would attempt to industrialize, but would predominantly remain a region of farming and agriculture. Now, we have a different perspective because Richmond rose from the ashes, right? And was rebuilt as an industrial economy. But I'm sure there are times that you've been to parts of the South that are still very rural and agricultural, right? The entire South does not move toward industry. So the legacy of the New South was a social ideology which prevented equality through the passage of segregation laws known as Jim Crow. Also, the mentality and the ideology of the lost cause that brought about the erection of and memorials of Confederate leaders in the American South that we've actually lived through the era in which many of those have come down. Often people ask me what my opinion is, and I tell them it's kind of interesting that these statues ever came up in the first place, because most of these defeated leaders would have probably never cared to have statues or memorials erected for their service. There is one guy that stands out that would have absolutely loved a statue. Jed Stewart. The guy was very vain. He would have absolutely loved a statue anywhere put up with him. But this is the inception point of the lost cause ideology. That's the unveiling of Lee's statue on what will become Monument Avenue on May 29th, 1890. The guy that pushes for this and gets the funding and the land donated and all the things will be Lee's nephew, Fitzhugh Lee. And that's how the ball begins to roll on these statues coming up. So, I know that this is a difficult piece of history because it remains with us. Over 150 years later, we're still grappling with the legacy of Reconstruction. But I do think it is important to address it because learning from these things make us better moving forward. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. So, any questions, comments, concerns? Anybody? Okay, cool. So, that's where we pump the brakes today.